Well, good morning. It is time again for another Bible study, and so thankful that you are with us again this morning as we continue through our study in the book, the Whole50. Hopefully you have one of these in front of you and you are walking through it alongside of us. If you are not walking through it alongside of us, you can actually get one by going to christtable.today. And that is where you're going to be able to get a copy of that. All you need to do, if you'd like to be a part of that, is to simply donate there, and I'll send one of those to you. Looking forward to having you a part of this Bible study the whole way through. And it's been great. We are now on day 12. And this is today, I believe, if I'm right, our first day in the New Testament. And so we'll be kind of jumping back and forth between the New Testament and the Old Testament, but glad that you are a part of that with us. And I'm working on the Bible study that's coming up after this one. I'll be telling you a little bit more about that in the days to come. But anybody who donates to christtable.today in the month of April will receive one of those for free. And it will begin in the middle of May. And so looking forward to doing that. It's going to be a fun one. It's going to be something to celebrate summer. Going to have a bit of a celebration and a party feel to it. And looking forward to putting that out there and getting it to you. So if you want that, feel free to donate in April to christtable.today. And I'll be telling you more about that in the days to come. But today, we are in one of the more difficult and more dramatic passages in the New Testament. Romans is one of the most difficult books. Doesn't really need to be difficult, but I think over the years we've made the book of Romans a lot more difficult than it needs to be. And Romans chapters 6 and 7 are perhaps in a difficult book, some of the more difficult sections in the difficult book. Paul becomes very transparent, and Paul also becomes very deep in what he says. And so what we've done is we've carved out a small section of Romans chapter 7 that kind of encapsulates everything that he says in Romans chapter 6 and Romans chapter 7. And we're going to tackle just that small part today. And so Romans chapter 7, verse 18. And I know that nothing good lives in me. Paul has been up until this point talking about his struggle with sin. Over the last few days, we've talked about David and King David and how it doesn't really matter who you are, how close to God you are, how high you are in your spiritual development. You still have the capacity to fall. You still have the capacity to sin. You never, while you're on this earth, outgrow that sinful nature completely. Even the best of us can do the worst of things. Paul frames it this way by saying, I know that nothing good lives within me. And then he kind of clarifies and says, that is in my sinful nature. So Paul says there's a part of me that still lives within me. Even though I'm a follower of Jesus Christ, this part of me is still there. And in that part of me, nothing good lives within that part of me. I want to do what's right, but I can't. Now, there's been a lot of arguing over the years from scholars and people who think they're a lot smarter than the rest of us, and maybe in some ways they are, as to whether or not Paul is writing about his life before Jesus or his life after Jesus. And part of the struggle here is that there is this desire to believe that whenever we come to Jesus, we have been fully set free from sin. And there's even some people who believe that you can get to a point in your life where you don't sin any longer. Now, there's a part to some of those ideas that I think is true. Once we follow Jesus, we have been released from this chain that requires us to sin. We now have the ability to overcome sin, but that sinful nature is still with us. So it's kind of like living in between two worlds. You're not fully sinful, but you're not fully sinless either. And so you're somewhere in between here where you have these two natures kind of in Jesus, there were these two natures that was both God 100% and man 100%. He was both fully God and fully man in the same person. In maybe a similar way, we have these two natures now within us, a nature that is both 100% human still, but also now is 100% redeemed. And they're sometimes maybe at war within us. Maybe you've felt that war within you. Like Paul says, I know what's right to do, but there are these moments where I just don't do it. Verse 19, I want to do what's good, but I don't. I don't want to do what's wrong, but I do it anyway. Such transparency here. I have to think that if followers of Jesus Christ, especially followers of Jesus Christ who are in public arenas, clergy, pastors, leaders would stand up and say, we struggle. We struggle with sin. We struggle with fear and hate. We struggle with wanting to do the right thing, but oftentimes doing it. We experience the same highs and lows that you do. We make mistakes. We wake up on the wrong side of the bed. We yell at our kids. We say mean things sometimes to our spouse. We kick the dog on occasion. Paul's doing that here. It's not an easy thing for someone like Paul, who's revered, to do. But Paul sets the example for us in saying, this is a part of who I am. And I don't like it. I don't love it. It's a struggle. But I need to be transparent that I struggle. But if I do what I don't want to do, I'm not really the one doing wrong. It's sin living within me that does it. Paul says, it's not as though there are two people living within me, but there are two natures within me that are at war. And Paul kind of describes it this way in these verses, that before he came to Christ, he was sin through and through. On the inside, there was this blackness, there was this sinful nature, but then on the outside, there's this flesh too that is sinful as well. But then he says, when he comes to Christ, Christ has now redeemed me, the soul. There's this part of me now that has been washed by the blood, and so kind of put the red inside of there. But I still have this flesh. I still have this thing that's a part of who I am, this nature that is still yet not fully redeemed. And so I'm living within two worlds. It's as though there are two things within me, a part of me that wants to do right, but a part of me that still is sinful and is prone to doing wrong. And so he says in verse 21, I've discovered this principle of life, that when I want to do what's right, I inevitably do what's wrong. Boy, this could be a life verse, right? It's not the ones we choose. Usually it's something like, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. But this verse 21, is really where most of us truly live. When I want to do what's right, I inevitably do what's wrong. I love God's law with all of my heart, but there is another power within me that's at war with my mind. Paul's just laying it out here, the truth. And I love that about what Paul says. This power makes me a slave to the sin that is still within me. And so now Paul is returning back to a language that he uses a lot about slavery. Oftentimes he feels like a slave. Is he a slave to the sin? Is he a servant to Jesus Christ? Or is he both at times? And Paul says, I don't like that. Verse 24, what a miserable person that I am. Who will free me from this life that is dominated by sin and death? Now, clearly the answer here is Jesus. Jesus will free him from this life that's dominated by sin and dominated by death. But before we get there, Paul gives us this image in this language here that actually the New Living Translation, which I use and love, kind of obscures with the way it writes this verse. In verse 24, there in the second sentence, it translates it as, "Who will free me from this life that is dominated by sin and death?" Which is an okay translation, but it actually obscures the image that Paul is painting here for us. What Paul literally says there is, "Who will free me from this body of death?" So I understand why they've written here, "Who will free me from this life that's dominated by sin and death," because that makes maybe more sense. But what Paul actually says here is, "Who will free me from this body of death?" Body of death. That's an interesting phrasing that maybe to the translators didn't make much sense, but to Paul's original readers, they would have immediately understood what was going on here, because in those days, warfare was barbaric. I mean, think we had the crucifixion, which is a very barbaric way to kill people, but it wasn't the only way that they used to kill people. Many other cultures had thought of many other wonderfully terrible ways in order to take human life, to cause pain. And so one of those ways was whenever there would be a battle and a group of people would be conquered, what would happen is and I should have looked this up. I forget who did this. Maybe I'll look it up and post in the comments which nation, which people group did this. But what they would do is they would take the people who had been killed on the battlefield and they would chain them to the people who were still alive. And so this was a way to brutally kill someone over a long period of time. It was almost like sport. So they would take a corpse, a dead person, and they would chain that corpse to a living person face to face. And so you have the living person here, you have the corpse here, and so they would chain those two together, a living body, and a dead body. And so chain the arm, chain the legs together, put a chain around the midsection, a chain around the neck, so that the living body and the dead body were face to face. And then they would leave them. Now, what happens is that corpse begins to rot. Worms begin to come in, maggots, and decay. What happens is that decay begins to slowly transfer from the corpse to the living body. And so it slowly actually eats away at the living body as the death that's within the corpse and the decay that's within the corpse slowly transfers itself into the living body, and the living person begins to die, decay, because of the death and the decay that's present within the corpse that it's chained to. And so this is exactly the image that Paul has in mind here when he says, "Who will free me from this body of death?" He's saying that I am chained to this corpse of decay, sin, that I can't get away from. I don't want to be chained to this thing, but I'm chained to this thing, and it is a body of death, and it feels as though it's suffocating me and destroying me. Who will free me from this? And the final verse, in fact, our reading didn't go to 25, but I'll go to 25, and I actually might even encourage you to go ahead and read the first verse of chapter 8 as well, the verse after this, but I'll leave that one for you and your reading. Who will free me from this body of death? Paul says, thank God The answer is in Jesus Christ our Lord. So you see how it is in my mind, I really want to obey God's law, but because of my sinful nature, I'm a slave to sin. And the only antidote for this death and decay is Jesus Christ. He's provided the answer, and that is available both now and not yet. I've been given, you might say, the first shot of the vaccine by accepting and following Jesus Christ. But I'm not fully inoculated. I'm not fully protected from sin. I won't be able to fully be released from this until I've been glorified in heaven. And so Paul and you and I are in this in-between time where we struggle with sin and decay of the soul, this flesh nature. But we also, because of Jesus Christ, thank God, are not subservient to it. We do have some control of it, an ability to not be controlled by it. But it's still chained to us. And that is part of the reality that we face each and every day. But Paul says, I'm not a slave. I'm not a slave to it. I want to, and I feel like I'm a slave to sin, but thank God the answer is Jesus Christ. And Paul's going to, in the next verse, chapter 8, verse 1, explain how he lives in that in-between space, that liminal space. It's been good being with you this morning. Look forward to being back with you tomorrow. Interested to hear your feedback in the comments and your thought on chapter 8, verse 1. But until that time, happy reading.